And here to give us his insights is Khalid Koser, Deputy Director of the Brookings Byrne Project on Internal Displacement. Khalid, welcome to Foreign Exchange.
Thank you.
What has caused this dramatic jump in the number of refugees?
As you indicate, there are complex reasons behind the rise, but I think it's fairly straightforward to me to say that Iraq is the main factor at the moment. We have at least 2.5 million Iraqis displaced outside their country as refugees, and that number alone has accounted for most of the increase that we've seen. It combines with, I think, disappointing returns to Afghanistan. We have about 3 million Afghans still displaced as refugees. Around 750,000 have gone back over the last year, but that's far fewer than was expected. So it seems to me that a combination of Iraq increasing numbers and Afghanistan not decreasing numbers accounts almost solely for the increase overall. It wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to suggest that the rising refugee numbers around the world have become an unintended consequence of the war on terror. Iraq and Afghanistan alone comprise half of the world's refugees.
And how many Iraqis have fled since the invasion overall, since 2003?
At least 2.5 million outside their country and at least 2.5 million inside their country. I think the only reason there aren't more refugees in Jordan and Syria is because Jordan and Syria have now closed their borders to refugees. So you have a situation where increasing numbers of Iraqis are leaving their homes but can't escape the country.
Right, so Jordan and Syria are really picking up the burden, at least as far as Iraqi refugees go.
Absolutely.
And most of these refugees, though, they want to come to the United States, but it's Amman and Damascus that's hosting them.
I'm not sure that most refugees want to come to the United States. There is this myth that somehow all refugees want to escape.
But most Iraqi refugees want to, don't they?
They may want to. Lots of refugees want to stay locally. I think lots of refugees hope that when peace comes, they'll be able to go home relatively quickly. Lots of refugees around the world, not just in Iraq, maintain links with home, perhaps maintain businesses and try to maintain their properties back at home. So for many refugees, it's worthwhile trying to stay close to their home rather than move too far away.
Right, and how would you explain the fact that most of them are in developing countries? Because there is this misconception in parts of the developed world, in Europe at least, that most refugees want to come and live in developed countries, but that isn't the case.
It isn't the case.
They're in Pakistan, they're in Jordan, they're in Syria.
And Iran.
Egypt, they're in Lebanon.
I think you're right. I think there's a myth there that needs to be exploded. Most refugees in the world, the great majority of refugees in the world are settled locally in neighbouring countries. Now, you're right that some of those people may wish to come further afield and move to industrialised countries, but many want to stay locally and stay near their countries. I think it's a combination of practicalities. Even though we have a revolution in transportation, it's still quite expensive to move around the world, especially for poor people, and many refugees are poor people. It's also clearly an implication of the restrictive policies that are being introduced, particularly in the European Union. It's very hard to get to the European Union as a refugee these days.
And let's talk a little bit more about Iraq. What kind of pressure is the influx of refugees putting on the resources and the relative population and resources of countries like Syria and Jordan? I mean, it's not a tented city in the sense that you can see all of the refugees like you can in Pakistan. Most of them are living in the suburbs of Amman and Damascus, 15 people sometimes to a room.
You're right, absolutely. I mean, don't forget Jordan already hosts something like 3 million refugees if you include the Palestinians. Here's another 1.5 million being added to that number. And I think the thing to remember for my country, the UK, for the USA, these are relatively poor countries hosting enormous numbers of refugees. Now, I think it rather puts in perspective our concerns about relatively small numbers of asylum seekers and refugees. By all accounts, conditions are becoming increasingly difficult for Iraqi refugees in Jordan and Syria. Many of them arrived with some savings and some resources, but those savings have been quickly spent. The Jordanian and Syrian governments are closing borders and making it more difficult for these people to work and to find accommodation. And so increasingly they're falling upon friends, upon relatives, upon savings, upon perhaps criminal activities to survive. I think it's a pretty desperate situation. And the real concern has got to be that even though there are some returns to Iraq, to certain pockets of safety, I don't think there's any real prospect of large-scale return to Iraq for the foreseeable future. And what will happen to these refugees in the long term, I think, is a real concern. If you look at Afghanistan, you have a protracted refugee situation. These people have been in exile for 25 years in some cases. And I think a real nightmare scenario for the US government, for Syria and Jordan, for the region as a whole, is if these refugees become a protracted long-term situation.
Do you see this refugee crisis as the most severe crisis that we're facing?
Iraq and Afghanistan combined, certainly. As I say, the numbers of those two countries alone combined account for half of the world's refugees.
And when you look at the impact that it's having on countries like Syria and Jordan, how is the local population responding to this influx of Iraqis?
I think the fair summary would be that the local population has been incredibly tolerant, and very tolerant when you compare it to many populations in more industrialised countries, but they're beginning to lose their patience, and I think that's an understandable aspect of hosting populations. Large numbers of refugees are moving. They continue to move in some forms, even though borders have been closed. There is inevitably some competition for jobs. There is inevitably negative impacts in terms of health consequences, in terms of overcrowding in accommodation, and people are becoming a bit fed up of it. And I think Jordanians and Syrians, if they're around this table, would say, I wish that the US and the UK would get on and solve the problems of Iraq and make sure that it was safe for people to go back so these people can go back to their home countries.
Why do you think it's in the interest of the United States to find a durable solution to the refugee problem, particularly with Iraqis?
You might start by saying it's a moral obligation. These populations have been displaced as a result of the Allies' actions. Whether or not that's justified, it's a fact, and I think one has to address that. I think there are serious concerns that large populations of refugees in Syria and Jordan may eventually destabilise those countries and perhaps destabilise the Middle East as a whole. And clearly the USA has an interest in maintaining stability in that part of the world. Many of these people, I think, will find themselves eventually marginalised, disenfranchised, disillusioned, and it's not too much of a leap of imagination to imagine some of those people then turning to radical groups, to
Hamas and Hezbollah.
Possibly, yeah. So I think there are possible security implications for this displacement that need to be addressed. And it seems to me very clear that in the range of very difficult issues that the USA has ahead of it in trying to solve the problems of Iraq, displacement really must be one of the main ones.
Khalid Koser, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.